Elderly woman rescued a golden retriever from trash, unraveling a mystery that changed her life. Margaret Thompson had always believed in small acts of kindness. At 74, her days were filled with routines meant to bring comfort to others, volunteering at the local animal shelter, baking pies for church fundraisers, and serving warm meals to those in need every Sunday afternoon. Her life was simple, her heart generous, and her home modest but cozy, nestled at the end of Maple Lane, where the sycamore trees bowed low as if paying respect to her gentle spirit. That Sunday was no different. The sun hung low in the winter sky, casting a golden glow across the snow-dusted church grounds. Margaret hummed softly as she tidied the kitchen, stacking the last of the plates and wiping down the counters. The scent of roasted turkey and apple pie still lingered in the air, mingling with the faint whiff of pine from the garlands strung along the windowsills. "Thank you again, Margaret. I don't know what we'd do without you," Pastor Harris said, his kind eyes crinkling with gratitude. Margaret waved off the compliment with a chuckle. "Oh, hush now. You'd manage just fine. Besides, it gives this old woman something to do on a Sunday afternoon." She gathered her scarf and gloves, preparing to head home before the evening chill set in. As she made her way to the back door to toss the trash, a faint sound stopped her in her tracks, a muffled whimper, barely audible above the rustling of the icy wind. Margaret paused, her heart tightening instinctively. She listened, straining to hear, but the sound faded as quickly as it had come. Shaking her head, she took another step toward the dumpster when it came again. Soft, pleading, and unmistakably desperate. Her breath hitched, and without another thought, she hurried toward the noise, her boots crunching against the thin layer of snow. Behind the church, where the shadows grew long and the cold seemed to bite a little harder, Margaret's eyes fell upon a trembling form curled up beside the dumpster. A golden retriever, its golden coat matted and tangled, lay shivering in the snow. Its ribs were visible beneath the dirt-caked fur, and one paw was bent at an unnatural angle. But it was the eyes that broke Margaret's heart the most. Amber eyes that held a pain so deep, so raw, that it felt like a silent cry for mercy. "Oh, you poor darling," Margaret whispered, her voice trembling, as she sank to her knees beside the wounded creature. The dog flinched but did not move away, its body too weak to resist. Margaret reached out slowly, her hand hovering just above its head. "It's okay, sweetie. I won't hurt you." She let her fingers brush lightly against the dog's matted fur, and the animal shivered but did not pull back. It looked up at her with those sorrowful eyes, and Margaret felt a pang deep within her chest. "Who would do this to you?" she murmured, her throat tightening. She gently ran her hand along the dog's back, feeling the sharp bones beneath its ragged coat. "Left out here to freeze. Oh, you poor, poor thing." Determination flooded through her veins, washing away any hesitation. She unwrapped her scarf and draped it over the trembling body, hoping to offer some semblance of warmth. "We can't leave you out here," she said firmly. "You're coming home with me." Margaret moved slowly, speaking in soft tones to reassure the dog as she slid her arms underneath its frail body. The dog let out a weak whimper, but its eyes never left hers, a flicker of trust igniting beneath the pain. "That's it, good boy. Or girl. Well, we'll figure that out later," she whispered, cradling the creature against her chest. It was alarmingly light, its body limp with exhaustion. She stood, her old knees protesting under the weight, but she held firm, clutching the dog tightly as she made her way to her car. The drive home was quiet, the only sound the faint, labored breathing of the wounded dog nestled on the passenger seat beneath Margaret's old quilt. She kept glancing over, her heart aching at the sight of its thin frame curled up so small, as if trying to disappear from the world. "You're safe now," she murmured, reaching over to rest her hand on its head. The dog's eyes flickered open, a weary gratitude shining through the pain. When they arrived at her cozy cottage, Margaret moved quickly, her years of caring for strays guiding her every action. She carried the dog inside, careful not to jostle its injured paw, and placed it gently on the worn couch in her living room. The fire crackled softly, spreading warmth throughout the room, and Margaret fetched blankets, tucking them around the shivering body. "There we go, nice and warm," she cooed, her voice soothing. She brought over a bowl of lukewarm water, holding it under the dog's nose. It sniffed tentatively before lapping at the water, its tongue moving slowly, as if each sip required tremendous effort. Margaret's eyes softened. "You must be starving too. I'll fix you something to eat." In the kitchen, she prepared a simple meal of boiled chicken and rice, gentle on an empty stomach. As she worked, her mind raced with questions. Where had the dog come from? How long had it been out there, suffering alone in the cold? And who could have been cruel enough to abandon such a beautiful creature? Returning to the living room, she knelt beside the couch and offered the food. The dog sniffed hesitantly before taking a cautious bite, then another, and soon it was eating ravenously, its body shaking from the effort. Margaret's heart broke at the sight. "Slow down, sweetheart. There's plenty more where that came from." She watched in silence, tears pricking at the corners of her eyes. When the bowl was empty, the dog looked up, licking its lips before resting its head on the cushion, eyes half closed in exhaustion. Margaret reached out, her fingers running gently through the tangled fur. "You need a name," she mused, her voice soft. "How about Buddy?" The dog's eyes flicked open, the faintest wag of its tail visible beneath the blanket. Margaret's face broke into a smile. "Buddy it is, then." She continued to stroke his head, her touch light and tender. "I don't know where you came from, or who did this to you, but you're safe now. I promise." Buddy's eyes drifted shut, his body relaxing against the cushions as sleep took over. Margaret sat beside him, watching his chest rise and fall with each breath, her heart swelling with a fierce protectiveness she hadn't felt in years. In that quiet moment, she made a silent vow. No matter what it took, she would help Buddy heal. She would give him the love and safety he deserved. As the fire crackled and the snow fell softly outside, Margaret knew her life had changed forever. The morning sun peeked through the curtains, casting soft golden rays across the living room. Margaret awoke in her armchair, her back aching from a night spent watching over Buddy. She blinked away the sleep from her eyes and glanced toward the couch, her heart skipping a beat when she saw it was empty. Panic surged through her veins. Had Buddy tried to leave? Was he hurt? But then she heard it, a faint rustling sound coming from the kitchen. Margaret rose quickly, wincing as her joints protested, and hurried toward the noise. She stopped in the doorway, her heart softening at the sight before her. There, standing unsteadily on three legs, was Buddy, his nose buried in the bowl she'd left on the floor. His injured paw was curled close to his body, and his golden fur, though still matted, seemed to catch the morning light, giving him an ethereal glow. Margaret watched as he ate, his movements slow but determined. Relief flooded her. He was strong, this one, stronger than she'd realized. "Well, someone's got quite the appetite," she said, her voice gentle and warm. Buddy's head shot up, his amber eyes wide with alarm. For a heartbeat, he stood frozen, his body tense, ready to flee. But then he saw Margaret's kind smile and relaxed, his tail giving a tentative wag. Margaret's heart melted. She took a cautious step forward, kneeling down to be at his level. "It's all right, Buddy. You're safe here." She reached out her hand, holding it palm up for him to sniff. Buddy hesitated, his eyes flicking between her face and her hand, his body still poised for escape. But curiosity won out, and he leaned in, his nose cold and wet against her skin. Margaret giggled softly. "See? I'm just an old lady who talks too much. Nothing to be afraid of." Buddy's ears twitched and his tail wagged again, this time with more confidence. Margaret's smile widened as she reached out and gently stroked his head. Buddy closed his eyes, leaning into her touch, his body visibly relaxing. "There we go," Margaret whispered. "Good boy." She continued to pet him, her fingers working through the tangles in his fur with gentle patience. As she sat there, she realized just how thin he was. His ribs were stark against his golden coat, and his injured paw was swollen and bruised. Margaret's brow furrowed. "We need to get you checked out," she said, her tone firm. "No arguing about it." She stood and reached for the phone, dialing the familiar number of the local vet. Dr. Whitaker had known Margaret for years, ever since she'd started volunteering at the animal shelter. He answered on the third ring, his voice warm and familiar. "Morning, Margaret. What can I do for you?" "I found a dog," she explained, her eyes never leaving Buddy. "Poor thing's been through quite an ordeal. He's hurt and thin as a rail. Think you could take a look at him today?" Dr. Whitaker didn't hesitate. "Of course. Bring him by whenever you're ready." Margaret thanked him and hung up, then turned back to Buddy, who was watching her with those soulful eyes. "Looks like we're going on a little adventure," she said with a chuckle. Buddy's ears perked up, and Margaret felt a flutter of hope. Maybe, just maybe, he understood her. She moved slowly, not wanting to startle him, as she found an old leash from her day's fostering rescues. She approached Buddy with it, her voice calm and reassuring. "Just a safety precaution, love. I won't pull, I promise." Buddy eyed the leash warily, but didn't move as Margaret gently looped it over his head. "Good boy," she praised, giving him a gentle scratch behind the ear. "You're doing great." She led him outside to her little blue sedan, opening the passenger door wide. Buddy hesitated, his nose twitching as he sniffed the unfamiliar car. "It's all right," Margaret coaxed. "Up you go." To her surprise, Buddy obeyed, clumsily hoisting himself onto the seat before curling up as small as he could. Margaret's heart twisted. He looked so vulnerable, his thin body trembling, despite his best efforts to be brave. She climbed into the driver's seat and gave his head a gentle pat. "I won't let anything happen to you, Buddy. I promise." The drive to the vet was quiet, the hum of the engine the only sound between them. Margaret stole glances at Buddy, who watched the world pass by with wide, cautious eyes. She wondered where he'd come from, what he'd been through before she found him. Who could abandon such a gentle soul? The thought made her chest tighten. When they arrived at the clinic, Dr. Whitaker was waiting, his silver hair messy as usual. "Well, would you look at that," he said, his eyes softening as he took in Buddy's frail form. "You've got yourself a fighter, Margaret." She smiled proudly. "That I do." Dr. Whitaker moved slowly, his voice low and soothing as he approached Buddy. "Hey there, fella. Let's get you checked out." Buddy trembled but didn't resist as Dr. Whitaker lifted him onto the exam table. Margaret stayed by his side, her hand resting on his head, whispering gentle reassurances. As the vet examined him, Margaret held her breath, praying that his injuries weren't too severe. Dr. Whitaker's face grew serious as he felt along Buddy's injured paw. "It's a sprain," he said finally, relief evident in his voice. "Painful, but it'll heal with some rest." Margaret exhaled, her shoulders sagging with relief. "Thank goodness." Dr. Whitaker continued his exam, his brow furrowing as he ran a scanner over Buddy's neck. A small beep sounded, and he looked up, his eyes curious. "He's chipped," he said, glancing at Margaret. "Maybe we can find out where he came from." Margaret's heart skipped a beat. Of course, a dog as well-behaved as Buddy had to have belonged to someone. But then why had he been left alone and injured? She looked down at Buddy, his eyes locked on hers, a flicker of fear in their amber depths. She rested her hand on his head, giving him a gentle scratch. "No matter what we find out," she whispered, "I won't let you go unless you're ready." Buddy's tail gave a weak wag, and Margaret's heart swelled with affection. Whatever the future held, she knew she'd keep that promise. Margaret couldn't shake the uneasy feeling that settled in her chest as she watched Dr. Whitaker examine the information on his computer screen. The faint hum of the machine and the rhythmic ticking of the clock on the wall seemed to amplify the tension in the room. Buddy lay curled up at her feet, his head resting on his good paw, his eyes flicking nervously between Margaret and the vet. She reached down, her fingers brushing gently through his fur. "It's all right, Buddy. Whatever this is, we'll face it together." Her voice was soft but steady, carrying a promise she intended to keep. Dr. Whitaker's eyes widened as he scanned the screen, his brow furrowing. He turned to Margaret, his expression serious but laced with curiosity. "Well, this is interesting." Margaret's heart skipped a beat. "What is it? Did you find his owner?" Dr. Whitaker leaned back in his chair, folding his hands thoughtfully. "The microchip is registered to a Samuel Vasquez. He was a police officer, a decorated captain, actually. The odd thing is, the records show he disappeared 3 years ago. No one ever found out what happened to him." Margaret's hand stilled on Buddy's fur, her eyes widening in shock. Disappeared? You mean this dog belonged to a missing man? Dr. Whitaker nodded slowly. Looks that way. The system says Buddy's real name is Max, and he was trained as a K-9 unit. He's highly skilled, Margaret. That explains why he's so obedient and protective. Margaret's gaze dropped to Buddy, who was watching her intently, his amber eyes reflecting a quiet intelligence that now made perfect sense. "Oh, Buddy," she whispered, her heart aching. "You've been through so much, haven't you?" Dr. Whitaker cleared his throat, his face grim. "There's more. The system flagged the account because of an unsolved case linked to Captain Vasquez. He was investigating a brutal dog fighting ring before he vanished. The department suspected foul play, but could never prove it. And now Buddy Max turns up out of nowhere?" He shook his head. "This is no coincidence." Margaret felt a chill run down her spine. Her fingers tightened protectively around Buddy's collar. "Are you saying someone might be looking for him? Someone dangerous?" Dr. Whitaker's eyes softened. "I don't know for sure, but it's possible. If Captain Vasquez was targeted because of his investigation, then Buddy might be the only witness to what really happened." The weight of his words settled heavily between them, the implications too terrible to fully comprehend. Margaret took a deep breath, forcing herself to stay calm. "What should I do? Should I contact the police?" Dr. Whitaker hesitated. That might be the safest option. But if someone was willing to hurt a police officer over this, they might not hesitate to come after the dog, or anyone protecting him. Margaret's blood ran cold, but she straightened her shoulders, resolve hardening in her chest. "I'm not giving him up," she said firmly, her eyes blazing with determination. "I found him, and he's safe with me. I won't let anyone hurt him again." Dr. Whitaker smiled softly, admiration flickering in his eyes. "I didn't think you would. Just be careful, Margaret. Whoever did this is still out there." Margaret nodded, her jaw set with unwavering resolve. "I'll keep him safe. I owe him that much." She gathered Buddy into her arms, his body trembling slightly as he leaned into her touch. "We're going home, Buddy. No one's going to take you away." As they left the clinic, Margaret's mind raced with questions. Who was Captain Vasquez? What had he uncovered that cost him his life? And how did Buddy Max escape? Her thoughts were interrupted as a shadowy figure watched them from across the street, eyes narrowing as Margaret lifted Buddy into her car. She felt a prickling sensation at the back of her neck but dismissed it as paranoia. She had more important things to worry about. The drive home was quiet, the weight of the revelation pressing heavily on Margaret's heart. She glanced at Buddy, who was lying quietly on the seat, his eyes fixed on the world outside. "Max," she murmured, testing the name. Buddy's head snapped around, his ears perking up, his eyes alert and focused. Margaret's chest tightened. "That's your real name, isn't it?" she whispered. "Max." Buddy's tail thumped weakly against the seat, and for a moment, Margaret saw a flicker of the dog he must have once been, strong, proud, fearless. But then the light faded, his body sinking back into the seat, weary and haunted. "Oh, Max," Margaret sighed, her eyes misting. "What did they do to you?" When they arrived home, Margaret brought Buddy inside, her mind whirling with thoughts of Captain Vasquez and the danger that could be lurking just beyond her door. She locked the windows and double-checked the front door, her heart thudding as she remembered Dr. Whitaker's warning. They might come looking for him. She shivered, glancing down at Buddy, who was watching her with those solemn, knowing eyes. "Well, if they do, they'll have to go through me first." She stroked his head, her voice soft but firm. "I've got you, Buddy. No one's going to hurt you again." Later that evening, as the fire crackled in the hearth and the shadows danced across the room, Margaret sat beside Buddy, her fingers gently scratching behind his ears. She wondered about Captain Vasquez. What kind of man he was, how much he must have loved Buddy to train him so well. And then, the thought that sent a chill through her. Did he die protecting Buddy? Protecting the secret that got him killed? She looked down at Buddy, his eyes closed, his breathing steady and calm for the first time since she found him. "Whatever you went through, you survived," Margaret whispered, her voice thick with emotion. "You're a fighter, Buddy, just like your owner." Buddy's tail thumped against the floor, and Margaret smiled through her tears, her heart aching with both sorrow and hope. "We'll get through this," she vowed. "Together." She leaned back, her eyes drifting to the window where the wind howled softly against the glass. She didn't see the dark figure standing beneath the street lamp, watching her house with cold, calculating eyes. She didn't see the flash of anger on his face, or the way his fists clenched as he turned and disappeared into the night. But Buddy did. His eyes flicked open, his body going rigid, his ears straining to catch the faintest sound. A low growl rumbled in his throat, his gaze fixed on the window, alert and wary. Margaret stroked his head absent-mindedly, lost in her thoughts. "It's all right, Buddy. We're safe here." But Buddy didn't relax. He knew better. The danger was far from over. It was just beginning. Margaret couldn't shake the feeling of unease that lingered in her chest long after the sun had dipped below the horizon. The house was quiet, save for the faint hum of the radiator and Buddy's steady breathing as he lay curled up beside her chair. The shadows stretched long across the room, dancing to the rhythm of the crackling fire, but Margaret felt no comfort from its warmth tonight. Her mind raced, replaying Dr. Whitaker's words over and over. If Captain Vasquez was targeted, Buddy might be the only witness to what really happened. The weight of that realization pressed heavily on her, tightening around her heart like a vice. She glanced down at Buddy, who was dozing fitfully, his legs twitching as if he were running in his dreams. A low whimper escaped his throat, and Margaret's heart broke. What horrors had he seen? What memories haunted him in his sleep? She reached down and stroked his head, her fingers gentle as she whispered, "You're safe now, Buddy. I won't let anyone hurt you." His eyes fluttered open, wide and alert, his gaze locking onto hers. For a moment, she saw a flicker of fear in those amber depths before he relaxed, recognizing her face. His tail gave a weak wag, and Margaret's chest tightened. "Oh, Buddy," she sighed, her fingers running through his fur. "I wish you could tell me what happened." Her phone buzzed on the table, breaking the heavy silence. Margaret flinched, her heart leaping into her throat as she grabbed it, her fingers trembling slightly. It was a text from Pastor Harris. "Just checking in, Margaret. Heard about the dog you rescued. Let me know if you need anything." She exhaled slowly, her body sagging with relief. "Of course. No need to be so jumpy." She typed a quick reply, assuring him she was fine, before setting the phone back down. But the tension didn't leave her shoulders. Her eyes drifted to the window, where the wind howled softly against the glass. She shivered, a chill running down her spine. Was someone out there, watching her? She stood abruptly, locking the front door and double-checking the windows before returning to her chair, her pulse still racing. The night dragged on, each minute ticking by with agonizing slowness. Margaret's eyes grew heavy, but she fought to stay awake, her mind refusing to let her rest. She replayed everything Dr. Whitaker had said, piecing together the fragments of the story. Captain Vasquez, the dogfighting ring, his mysterious disappearance, and now Buddy, no, Max, had reappeared, alone and injured. Was he running from someone? Hiding from whoever hurt his owner? Margaret's stomach churned. She'd never been involved in anything dangerous before. Her life was quiet, simple, predictable. But that was before Buddy had come crashing into her world, carrying with him a past she couldn't ignore. She looked down at him, his body finally relaxed in sleep, his chest rising and falling steadily. "I won't let them take you," she whispered fiercely. "No matter what." A sharp knock at the door shattered the silence, echoing through the house like a gunshot. Margaret's heart stopped, her body freezing as fear flooded her veins. Buddy's head snapped up, his ears pricking, his eyes instantly alert. Another knock, louder this time, more insistent. Margaret swallowed hard, her legs trembling as she stood. "Stay here, Buddy," she whispered, her voice barely audible. Buddy didn't move, his body tense, his eyes locked on the door. Margaret crept toward the window, pulling the curtain back just enough to peer outside. A man stood on her porch, his shoulders hunched against the cold, his hands shoved deep into the pockets of his coat. She didn't recognize him. Her pulse quickened, and she backed away from the window, her mind racing. Was he looking for Buddy? Did he know about Captain Vasquez? The man knocked again, his fist thudding against the wood. Hello? Is anyone home? His voice was muffled by the door, but there was no mistaking the urgency in his tone. Please, I just want to talk. Margaret's heart pounded, her instincts screaming at her to stay silent, to wait him out. But then she heard it, the waver in his voice, the unmistakable tremor of pain and grief. She hesitated, her hand hovering over the doorknob. What if he was telling the truth? What if he needed help? Taking a deep breath, she unlocked the door and opened it just a crack, keeping the chain latched. Who are you? She demanded, her voice firm but wary. The man's eyes widened, relief flooding his face. You have him, don't you? You have Max. Margaret's blood ran cold. She gripped the door tighter, her knuckles turning white. I don't know what you're talking about, she lied, her voice steady despite the fear curling in her chest. The man's shoulders slumped, his face crumpling as he ran a hand through his hair. Please, he begged, his voice cracking. I know he's here. Dr. Whitaker called me. He said you found my dad's dog. Margaret's breath caught in her throat. Your dad, she whispered, her grip on the door loosening. The man nodded, his eyes shining with tears. Captain Samuel Vasquez. Max was his partner. I'm his son, Daniel. The name hung in the air, heavy with grief and longing. Margaret's heart ached, her fear giving way to compassion. You're Daniel? She whispered, her voice softening. You're his son? Daniel nodded, his shoulders trembling. I've been looking for him for 3 years. When my dad disappeared, Max went missing too. I thought they were both gone. His voice broke, his eyes pleading. Please, I just want to see him. I need to know he's okay. Margaret's chest tightened, her heart breaking for the man standing on her porch, his face etched with pain and desperation. She glanced over her shoulder, her eyes landing on Buddy, who was watching them from the hallway, his body rigid, his eyes wide with recognition. Oh, Buddy, she whispered, her throat tightening. You knew, didn't you? Buddy's tail gave a tentative wag, his eyes never leaving Daniel's face. Margaret turned back to the door, her heart pounding as she unlocked the chain and pulled it open. Come in, she said softly, stepping aside to let Daniel in. His eyes locked on Buddy, his breath catching as he dropped to his knees, his hands shaking. Max, he whispered, his voice breaking. Is it really you? Buddy stood frozen, his body trembling as he took a hesitant step forward, his eyes never leaving Daniel's face. And then, with a whimper, he rushed forward, burying his head in Daniel's chest, his tail wagging furiously. Daniel wrapped his arms around him, his shoulders shaking as he buried his face in Buddy's fur, his tears soaking into the golden coat. I thought I lost you, he choked out, his voice raw with emotion. I thought I lost you both. Margaret watched, her eyes misting as Buddy's whimpers turned into joyous barks, his body wriggling with happiness. In that moment, she knew she had made the right choice. Whatever danger lay ahead, they would face it together. Margaret watched as Daniel held Buddy close, his shoulders trembling with silent sobs, his fingers tangled in the dog's fur as if afraid to let go. Buddy whimpered, his body pressed tightly against Daniel's chest, his tail wagging furiously, his entire form vibrating with joy and relief. It was as if the world outside had fallen away, leaving only this moment, a long-awaited reunion that spoke of love, loss, and hope. Margaret felt a lump form in her throat, her eyes misting as she witnessed the bond between man and dog, a bond that had endured even through pain and separation. She wiped a tear from her cheek, her heart swelling with both sorrow and joy. He never gave up on you, she whispered softly, her voice breaking. He was waiting all this time. Daniel looked up, his eyes red and swollen, his face streaked with tears. I thought he was gone, he choked out, his voice raw with emotion. When Dad disappeared, Max vanished too. I looked everywhere, called every shelter, put up flyers, but there was nothing. No leads, no sightings. It was like they both vanished into thin air. He buried his face in Buddy's fur, his shoulders shaking. I thought they were together, that maybe Maybe they both. His words broke off, his voice cracking under the weight of his grief. Margaret felt her chest tighten, her heart aching for this young man who had lost so much. She knelt beside him, placing a gentle hand on his shoulder. "I'm so sorry, Daniel," she murmured, her voice thick with compassion. "I didn't know. I didn't realize how much you've been through." Daniel shook his head, his fingers stroking Buddy's golden coat as if to reassure himself that this wasn't a dream. "It's not your fault," he said softly, his eyes never leaving Buddy's face. "You saved him. You gave him a chance when no one else did. I can't thank you enough for that." Margaret's heart swelled, a warm blush creeping up her cheeks. "I didn't do much," she protested gently. "He was the one who fought to survive. He's stronger than he looks." Daniel let out a shaky laugh, his eyes shining with gratitude. "That he is. Dad always said Max was the toughest dog he'd ever known. Loyal to the end." His face fell, his eyes darkening as the weight of his father's loss settled over him once more. "I just wish I knew what happened that night, why they both disappeared." Margaret felt a chill run down her spine. She glanced at Buddy, who had grown quiet, his body pressed protectively against Daniel's side, his eyes fixed on Margaret's face with an intensity that sent shivers through her. She swallowed hard, her voice low and cautious. "Daniel, Dr. Whitaker told me about your father, about the investigation he was working on before he disappeared." Daniel's face tightened, his jaw clenching as he looked away, his shoulders rigid with tension. "Yeah, the dog fighting ring. Dad was close to shutting them down. Too close, maybe." His voice grew cold, his eyes hardening. "They tried to scare him off, vandalized our house, threatened him, but Dad wouldn't back down. He said those people needed to be stopped, that no dog should suffer like that." Margaret's heart twisted, her eyes stinging with tears. "Your father was a brave man," she whispered, her voice trembling. "He did the right thing." Daniel's shoulders sagged, his face crumpling as he hugged Buddy closer. "He paid for it," he said bitterly, his voice breaking. "They got to him before he could expose them. They made it look like an accident, a robbery gone wrong. But I knew better. I knew it was them. I just couldn't prove it." His hands shook, his fingers tightening in Buddy's fur. "I thought Max was killed too. I thought they took him because he was evidence, because he saw who did it." Margaret felt the blood drain from her face, her body going cold. "You think Buddy witnessed your father's murder?" Daniel's eyes were dark, haunted. "I'm sure of it. Max was with Dad that night. He was his partner, his protector. If he survived, that means he saw everything. He knows who did it." His voice wavered, his hands trembling. "And if they find out he's alive, they'll come after him. They'll kill him to protect their secret." Margaret's heart thudded painfully in her chest, her eyes widening with fear. "Oh God, they'll come here. They'll come looking for him." Daniel's face hardened, his eyes flashing with determination. "They won't get him. Not this time. I lost my father to those monsters. I won't lose Max, too." He stood, his body radiating anger and purpose. "We have to protect him. We have to keep him safe until we figure out who's behind this." Margaret felt a surge of resolve rise within her, her fear melting away in the face of Daniel's courage. She stood beside him, her chin lifted defiantly. "You're right. We'll keep him safe. I won't let anything happen to him. Not as long as I'm breathing." Daniel looked at her, his eyes softening with gratitude. "Thank you, Margaret. I didn't know where to turn. You don't know how much this means to me." Margaret smiled, her heart warming despite the danger that loomed. "You're family now, Daniel, both of you, and family protects each other." Buddy's tail thumped against the floor, his eyes bright with understanding as he looked from Margaret to Daniel. His body pressed close to the boy he'd loved and lost. A loud crash shattered the quiet, followed by the sound of breaking glass. Margaret's heart lurched, her blood turning to ice. "What was that?" she whispered, her voice trembling. Daniel's face went pale, his body going rigid. "They found us." His eyes were wide with panic as he grabbed Margaret's arm, pulling her toward the hallway. "We have to go. Now!" Buddy barked, his body tense, his eyes locked on the shattered window where the wind howled through the broken glass, carrying with it the unmistakable scent of danger. Margaret's heart raced, her legs moving on instinct as she followed Daniel, her mind spinning with fear and confusion. But how did they find us? She gasped, her chest tightening. Daniel's face was grim, his eyes hard as he led her toward the back door. They must have followed me. I was so focused on finding Max. I didn't realize they were tracking me. His voice was heavy with guilt and anger. I put you both in danger. I'm so sorry. Margaret's heart softened, her hand squeezing his arm. We'll get through this. Together. Buddy growled low in his throat, his body pressed against her leg, his eyes blazing with loyalty and protectiveness. Margaret looked down at him, her heart swelling with love and admiration. We're not alone. We've got Buddy. Daniel's face softened, his eyes shining with hope. Yeah, we've got him. And as they slipped out the back door, the shadows moving in closer, Margaret knew they would fight with everything they had to protect each other, to protect Buddy, to protect the truth. The night was cold and unforgiving as Margaret, Daniel, and Buddy fled through the shadows, the bitter wind biting at their faces as they navigated the narrow alley behind Margaret's house. Buddy stayed close, his body pressed protectively against Margaret's leg, his ears perked and alert, his eyes constantly scanning the darkness. Daniel's breathing was ragged, his face pale under the dim streetlights as he led them toward the safety of his car parked a block away. Hurry, he urged, his voice tense. We don't have much time. Margaret's heart raced, fear tightening around her chest like a vice. She could still hear the echo of shattering glass, the sharp crack as the window burst inward, sending shards flying across her living room floor. Whoever they weren't just trying to scare her, they were coming for Buddy. They rounded the corner, Margaret's legs trembling as she struggled to keep pace. Daniel's car was just ahead, parked beneath a flickering street lamp. Relief flooded through her veins, her shoulders sagging as she stumbled toward the passenger door. But then she heard it, a low rumble, the unmistakable growl of an engine coming to life. Her heart skipped a beat as headlights flared to life, blinding her with their harsh, white glare. Get down, Daniel shouted, shoving her behind a parked truck just as the car roared forward, tires screeching against the pavement. The vehicle sped past, the windows tinted dark, the faces inside hidden from view. But Margaret didn't need to see them to know who they were. The men who killed Captain Vasquez had found them. Buddy's growl rumbled low and menacing, his body tense, his eyes locked on the car as it rounded the corner and disappeared into the night. Margaret's hands shook as she clung to his fur, her heart thudding painfully in her chest. They're trying to scare us, Daniel muttered, his jaw clenched. They want us to run, to make it easy for them. His eyes hardened, his shoulders squaring with determination. We're not going to play their game. Not anymore. He turned to Margaret, his gaze fierce. We have to end this. Tonight. Margaret's blood ran cold, her hands tightening around Buddy's collar. How? We don't even know who they are. Daniel's eyes darkened, his face hardening. But Max does. He saw them the night they killed my father. He remembers. Buddy's ears perked, his tail going rigid as he looked up at Daniel, his eyes sharp and focused. Margaret's heart ached as she realized the truth. All this time, Buddy had been carrying the memory of that night. The pain, the fear, the loss. He hadn't just been running from danger. He'd been running from the ghosts that haunted him. Margaret's voice wavered as she stroked his head. You're so brave, Buddy. So strong. We'll face this together. I promise, Buddy leaned into her touch, his eyes closing for just a moment before he straightened, his body going taut with purpose. He was ready. Daniel's plan was simple but dangerous. They would lure the men out of hiding, force them to reveal themselves. And they would use Buddy's memory to identify the killers once and for all. It was risky, but it was the only chance they had. Margaret's hands trembled as she dialed Pastor Harris's number, her voice steady as she asked him to call the police and meet them at the old warehouse by the docks. It's the only place big enough for this, Daniel explained, his eyes fixed on the road as they sped toward the waterfront. If things go wrong, there'll be plenty of places to hide, and Max knows the layout. Dad used to train him there. Margaret swallowed hard, her chest tightening with fear. And if they don't show up? Daniel's face was grim, his eyes hard. They will. They want Max dead. They won't pass up the chance. They arrived at the warehouse just as the moon rose high above the city, its silver light casting eerie shadows across the crumbling walls. The air was cold, heavy with the scent of salt and rust as the wind howled through the broken windows. Margaret shivered, her breath visible in the frigid air as she followed Daniel inside, Buddy close at her side. The vast, empty space stretched out before them, the darkness swallowing their footsteps as they moved deeper into the building. "Stay close," Daniel whispered, his eyes scanning the shadows. "They'll come. We just have to wait." The silence was suffocating, each second stretching into an eternity as Margaret's heart raced, her body tense with anticipation. And then she heard it, the faint echo of footsteps, the murmur of voices carried on the wind. Her blood ran cold as shadows moved along the walls, figures emerging from the darkness, their faces obscured by the dim light. Buddy's growl cut through the silence, low and threatening, his body poised to attack. The men stopped, their eyes narrowing as they took in the scene. "You're a fool, Daniel," one of them sneered, his voice dripping with contempt. "You should have stayed out of this, just like your old man should have." Daniel's face twisted with rage, his fists clenched at his sides. "You killed him. You murdered my father because he found out the truth." The man's lips curled into a cruel smile. "He was in the way, just like you are now." He raised his arm, the cold gleam of a gun catching the moonlight. "It's over, kid. Say goodbye." Margaret's heart stopped, her body frozen with fear as she watched the gunman take aim. But then Buddy moved, his body a golden blur as he lunged, his powerful jaws clamping down on the man's arm. The gun went off, the shot echoing through the warehouse, but the bullet went wide, shattering a window high above. Chaos erupted, the men shouting as Buddy snarled, his body twisting as he brought the man to the ground. Daniel moved fast, his fist connecting with another attacker's jaw, sending him sprawling. Margaret stumbled back, her eyes wide with terror as the fight raged on, the shadows dancing wildly around them. The sound of sirens cut through the noise, flashing red and blue lights spilling through the windows as the police stormed in, weapons drawn. "Freeze!" they shouted, their voices commanding. "Drop your weapons!" The men hesitated, their eyes darting toward the exits. But there was no escape. One by one, they surrendered, their guns clattering to the floor as the police moved in, cuffing them and dragging them away. Buddy stood over the first man, his body rigid, his eyes blazing with fury. Margaret's heart broke as she saw the pain in his eyes, the anguish of reliving that terrible night. She moved toward him, her hands trembling as she whispered, "It's over, Buddy. You did it. You're safe now." Buddy's body relaxed, his shoulders sagging as he turned to her, his eyes softening. He limped toward her, his head pressing into her chest as she wrapped her arms around him, tears streaming down her face. "You're so brave," she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. "I'm so proud of you." Daniel's face crumpled as he sank to his knees beside them, his arms wrapping around Buddy, his shoulders shaking with silent sobs. "We did it, Max. We did it," he choked out, his voice breaking. "Dad can rest now. He can finally rest." Margaret held them both, her heart full as she whispered, "You're not alone anymore. We're a family, all of us." And as the first light of dawn broke over the horizon, bathing them in golden light, Margaret knew they had found more than justice that night. They had found each other. They had found hope. This story is a powerful reminder of the resilience of love, loyalty, and courage. Through Buddy's journey, we see that even in the face of pain and loss, hope can be found when hearts refuse to give up. Margaret's compassion and Daniel's determination show us the strength of family, one that isn't always defined by blood, but by the bonds we choose to protect. Their courage to seek the truth reminds us that justice is worth fighting for, no matter the cost. Most importantly, Buddy's loyalty teaches us that love can endure even the darkest of times and that healing is possible when we stand together. Thank you for joining us on this emotional journey. If this story touched your heart, don't forget to like the video, share it with someone who needs a little hope today, and subscribe to our channel for more powerful stories of love, courage, and inspiration. Your support helps us continue bringing you tales that remind us of the goodness that still exists in the world. Until next time, stay kind, stay strong, and never lose hope.